Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kerr, and we're coming to you from Film Scene in downtown Iowa City. Happy to have you join us for the third part in this series, Energy, Cultures, and the Age of the Anthropocene. Before we start, I want to invite you to join us for these live shows if you can, or catch them later on UITV, on YouTube, or iTunes. You can also find them on the International Programs website, which is international.uiowa.edu. And to learn more about Film Scene, go to icfilmscene.org. So we've entitled this segment of our series, The Human Touch, and we'll be looking at the Anthropocene through the eyes and imaginations of artists and writers, photographers, and interpretive scholars, people who are chroniclers of our times and times past of a different sort. We'll be asking what the arts have to contribute to a conversation that in many ways seems to be science-driven. So joining us are two people that I'm very proud to introduce. Erica Damon is a University of Iowa student just next to me here. She is getting a Ph.D. in an interdisciplinary Ph.D. program in the Environmental Humanities, and so nice to have you here, Erica. Thank you.
Yeah.
And next to her is Eric Gidal, who is an associate professor in the University of Iowa Department of English. Great pleasure to have you here, Eric. Thanks.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think we will start perhaps with you, Erica, and discuss an art piece that you have done that in fact is going to be shown in Berlin. I'm not quite sure when the installation occurs, but I know that it'll be up for a year. Was it Berlin or Munich? Munich. But an international show.
Yeah.
Very cool. Please tell us what this art piece is and how it relates to this thing we're calling the Anthropocene.
Okay, wonderful. So I didn't know it related to the Anthropocene until I had some time to think about it and actually pitch it at a conference as something that related to the Anthropocene. But the piece is about 3 lakes in northwest Iowa that were drained at the turn of the 20th century using 40 head of oxen and a double moldboard lister plow. And at the base of these lakes that are now cornfields are these wind turbines. And I was trying to think about how to think about human history in that place and do some sort of community engagement project that was also visually or aesthetically interesting. So I came up with this map that is a topographic map but is also a puzzle piece. So each block is about the size of a children's building block, and each piece has the top of a topographic map on it. So when you put it all together, you see the indentations of the lakes that are remnants from the Pleistocene epoch or era. I don't. Stratigraphers in the room, please don't correct me. So then if you were to flip all of the pieces over, there's a painting of oxen along with the wind turbines. And so the installation invited local school children and adults to play with it and try to put it together. And kind of by chance, what I realized is people would sit down and spend a great deal of time with it, and they really took to it, and they would sit down and they would have conversations about, you know, their parents' farmland, or the fact that their dad was putting in more tile because the soil was wetter for a longer amount of time, or that they had a favorite place that they used to be able to swim in, but they could not anymore because of it wasn't clean. So these really kind of difficult questions that are related to the Anthropocene were being brought up just by chance and really comfortably in a way that I thought, whoa, this is a real opportunity. So that piece was accepted to a show at the Deutsches Museum in Munich about the Anthropocene, and specifically for playing with and through the Anthropocene. So this idea of play and these very difficult environmental or ecological questions that we have.
Well, and I know you're working on your PhD, and
Yeah.
this whole business of games and play is really foremost in your thought, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, I'm working on putting together several different types of games with the idea that play might be a platform for exploring difficult conversations around climate change in the Anthropocene, so that these games would be a platform or an opportunity to invite public to play and then to have a conversation as well. So one of them, with the help of my advisor, is an idea about Scrabble, or a riff off of Scrabble. So word construction and species extinction. And so you would remove one letter at a time and see if people can still start to construct their words in Scrabble form, but in relation to other species being removed. And then the other is a memory game. And so you would, on the back face, remember memory, like there'd be an apple or a basket, and you would like flip them over. These would include non-human species who live in our gut or make up our soil, folks that we're really dependent upon but we don't see very often.
And you told me something about a sow bug. What was that all about?
So last semester I had the opportunity to work with the Climate Narrative Project here at the University of Iowa's Office of Sustainability. And I interviewed a sow bug. So a sow bug is anyone familiar? Yeah, okay, so they're very small and they are part of the soil decomposition group who make our soil. And so part of that project was interviewing a sow bug and finding out what exactly do you do on a daily basis? What is your world like? How did last year's 55-inch frost line affect you? Things like that. But in all seriousness, I had someone speak as a sow bug, and then I drew a picture or did a film of a sow bug and delivered it as an interview.
Yeah. So you have an MFA in sculpture, and then the reason you're going after this kind of very creative Ph.D., I didn't know about this program in the Environmental Humanities, which I guess sounds as though it's very much designed by the individual person who wants to put the Ph.D. program together. But maybe you can tell us how you went from sculpture into this Environmental Humanities program.
Yeah, so many people in environmental humanities programs in other universities come from creative writing backgrounds or an English background, perhaps philosophy. But for me, I came out of a critical art practice that was already engaged with or out in the community, and I was already concerned about environmental questions. So it became a natural progression to do critical art practice with scholarly or research work. So it was an opportunity to take classes in geography, urban and regional planning, American studies, anything that had to do with our environment and human meaning making, so that those things come together in the environmental humanities.
So will you have a chance to see your piece when it's on display in Munich?
I'm hoping to go there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm hoping to go there in September. So.
Wow. Well, terrific. Well, let's move down the line here and talk about Gidal. So you're from the Department of English, and I know that you've been working on some books related to environmental writing over a period of time. Can you tell us a little bit about this research you've been doing?
Sure, and I also hope to talk about the class I've been teaching, but yeah, so I'm a scholar of 18th and 19th century British literature, and from the perspective of the Anthropocene, that kind of sense of a literary period starts to take on a very different kind of connotation, because if we follow people like Paul Crutzen, who identifies the Industrial Revolution as really a geological break as well as a literary break, then it asks us to think about how literary history and geological history begin to coordinate. So even studying, in some sense, a very kind of traditional area like 18th century British poetry and the rise of the novel and the rise of the periodical essay begins to take on a kind of flavor of having a much more deeper and far-reaching kind of environmental history. Some of the work I've done has looked at certain genres of expression during the 18th century, the periodical essay, Georgic poetry. I've looked at thinking about climate and climate change. In the 18th century, there was a lot of thinking about climate change. They tended to look at the effect of deforestation and the drainage of wetlands as having very determinable effects on at least microclimates. The difference was they tended to view this as a very benevolent activity and saw it as part of kind of civilizing the planet in some sense. And during the period of the French Revolution and a lot of the utopian thinking that goes on around that, both in France and in England, a lot of people begin to imagine a future state in which, in fact, the world's climates will be completely altered to suit humanity and, in fact, allow a kind of realization or apotheosis of the human spirit. So just simply doing a kind of intellectual history of climate change can orient ourselves, I think, towards thinking about the ways in which we view our own relationship now as geological agents on the planet.
So tell us about this course you're
Oh
teaching.
yeah, so I'm teaching a course on literature of the Anthropocene because I've been doing a lot of this mostly in the terms of my own scholarship and working on different books and essays. But I was really keen, particularly because of the symposium that's coming up, to offer a course for undergraduates to bring them into the conversation, but still basing it on what my own expertise is. So this is a course in 18th and 19th century British literature, except we're entitling it Literature of the Anthropocene. We're reading works like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Charlotte Bronte's Shirley, but we're reading them not simply as part of a kind of cultural history, but almost in part of a kind of environmental and even, dare we say it, a kind of geological history. And the students and I have been exploring the ways in which not only the attitudes expressed, say, by Robinson Crusoe on his island as he transforms this landscape to suit his own needs, but the impulse and ideas and communications that enable someone like Daniel Defoe sitting in London to begin to imagine this world. We're looking at the kinds of environmental, economic, and increasingly industrial forces that enable new forms of expression. And the intent, as we've been moving through this literature, is not really to tut-tut and condemn the British imperialists and colonialists. There's a place for that, and it's not without our not completely outside the range of our conversation. But one of the things I've been trying to emphasize with the students, and that they've been helping me to realize, is that we need to also understand the enormous appeal of a lot of this vision. Robinson Crusoe was, for many people, a kind of apotheosis of autonomous individualism and a kind of self-realization of a new rising middle class. We've been looking at Gilbert White, who does a fascinating natural history of Selborne, which is a small parish south of London. I figured it out, it's about half the size of Iowa City. And he spends 4 or 5 years simply recording bird migrations, flora and fauna all around the area, and keeping detailed records of this, but communicating with other naturalists, not only in the British Isles, but elsewhere, and beginning to link his observations with observations of other people, so that collectively they begin to understand patterns not only of migration, but of species extinction and environmental change. And on the one hand, there's a kind of wonder to someone like White, who's able to do this already in the 1780s, even as there also is, again in the context of our own situation, a kind of ominous tone as the processes of anthropogenic environmental transformation that he's already beginning to record as accelerating, we can now see as part of a kind of unfortunate lineage that we've inherited ourselves.
Well, and then, of course, in the next century, you have Charles Darwin coming along. And the presence of all of that conversation must have affected literature in
Absolutely,
England.
right. So a lot of people have been thinking about the effect of Darwin, and also Charles Lyell, who was a prominent geologist whose thought very much affected Darwin as well, as leading into everything from the development of the realist novel to new forms of poetry that become quite prominent in the 19th century, the way the 19th century begins to think about epic and these larger narratives and its relationship to changing landscapes. Part of the research I've been doing has been into a very curious body of literature called the Poems of Asean, which was a rendition of Gaelic oral poetry. And one of the things you see going on in the 19th century is a number of people beginning to try to situate this poetry within the landscape of Ireland and Scotland and Northern England, even as they start to record the geomorphological and industrial transformations going on all around them. So Darwin's notion of the evolution of species, Lyell's notion of the kind of transformation of landscapes over time begin to also affect the way people start to think about antiquarian literature at the same period. And you see all of these kinds of conversations intersecting. And not only intersecting in terms of a sense of human history, but also a sense of ethical obligation.
Mm-hmm. So you've both heard the earlier discussions we've had in this program about, you know, sort of a moral stance toward future generations and those living today, you know, our responsibilities for environmental justice and so on. Does that come through this literature that you're talking about? Is there?
I would say yes. And
yes.
There's an anecdote I've been wanting to share. A student of mine who I don't think is here, and I'm not going to name him anyway, but wrote a wonderful essay about a week ago. We've been looking at Georgic poetry. So Virgil, the Latin poet, wrote eclogues. He wrote the Aeneid, the great epic of the Roman Empire. He also wrote the Georgic poems, which are all poems about farming and agriculture. And oddly enough, in the 18th century, there's a huge revival of Georgic poetry. Everybody starts writing Georgic poetry again. And again, it also has to do with the awareness of being at the heart of an increasingly global empire and a kind of ethical obligation to care for the land. Well, the opening lines of Virgil's Georgic talk about making the crops rejoice. And my student, who hails from Newton, Iowa, thought about the oddity of making crops, which as we know in Iowa are really a commodity, making commodities rejoice. And becoming aware of the kinds of ethics and lack of ethics, and getting back to the last panel's discussion of environmental justice and injustice, involved in the kind of plant closings and exploitations of the landscape that have been an unfortunate part of Iowa history. And thinking about this kind of mandate of Georgic poetry to not simply celebrate the wild places of nature, but to let the crops, let the commodities, let the product of human labor rejoice in a more sustainable fashion. So I think one of my heroes, Madame de Staël, said every work of literary criticism is a work of ethics. And I think every time we start to look into this literature, both of the past and present, we're inevitably confronted with various questions of ethical obligation.
Yeah. Well, we had earlier spoken as well, and you said that you wanted to talk about this larger question of the humanities. What does the humanities have to say about things like the Anthropocene and changes around us now, changes in the past? What do the humanities have to say about these things that some people would put in a scientific box or in a political box?
Well, think about Erica's puzzle, right, which is a wonderful kind of hands-on and physical material expression of the intersection of geological history, of industrial history, of human history, and all through a very kind of creative and expressive form. And what the humanities often do is look at the history of human imagination. Science tells us a lot about the history of planetary systems, both large and small. The humanities looks not only at the aesthetic potential of the human species, but also the history of how we've imagined things in the past and how we might imagine things in the future. And I think one of the real benefits of the humanities, particularly in a kind of historical perspective, whether it's cultural history or geological history, is to allow us to consider the ways in which the forms by which we've imagined our situation in the past have both served us well and also have not served us to the benefit of ourselves and of the planet, and to begin to try to push against those forms of imagination and think about new possibilities. And that can be done in the arts, and it can be done in scholarship, I believe, as well, as we both look at the arts and literature of the past, present, and now the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, Eric, I'm picking up on that point from Eric. What do you think that your role as an artist is, as a sculptor is? Presumably, I'm just guessing, maybe some of your work doesn't have a message, if we might think of this as a message, a sort of a teaching component. I don't know if it does or doesn't. But for those times when you're doing a work like this piece that's going to be shown in Germany, this puzzle, there are so many layers to that involve interpretation, explanation, investigation, new ways to imagine things. Do you see that as what you do in each of your art creations, whether they might relate to the environment or whether they are just something else?
Yeah, I find it very difficult to, for some time I found it very difficult to divorce what I do from questions of the environment. Jane Bennett is a scholar of materiality, and she talks about turning towards the geologic, and that artists and thinkers and writers and creative folk who don't take into account the geologic risk being irrelevant or dangerous at best or worst. And so I think I can use her same sort of logic for environmental questions or the Anthropocene as a much larger umbrella, that most of what I make intersects with questions of the environment, humans, non-humans, maybe water quality, fields, old technology, new technology, but always in that same vein.
Well, and also you're using materials, you're creating things from something else, in this case, wooden blocks or maybe rocks, whatever substance you're using comes from something, comes from some place, and you're disturbing its natural form in order to make a new statement. So,
paying attention to, like, making work, but also paying attention to what you're using to make the work is important, absolutely.
Yeah. And is this a field that many people here at Iowa, at the University of Iowa in the art area, are there others like you who are involved in thinking about things in this very real environmental sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a growing number of us. There's some in this room right now who are doing some really great work around climate. And it's certainly a conversation that's being had at the School of Art and Art History, and outside, absolutely, yeah. And looking for creative and new ways of addressing very serious issues and taking, as Andrew said, out of the ivory tower and into the community. So.
Yeah. How do your students take to this whole class? I imagine some of the students who signed up for our class on literature of the Anthropocene are kind of wondering, huh? You know,
Yeah.
what is that?
Yeah. The first day of class, before I even started, someone asked me a question. She said, "What is the Anthropocene?" I thought, okay, that's where we're starting here. Some of the students have come in already very primed to think about these questions, environmental. Others took it because it met on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10:30 to 11:20. And that's fine. I kind of, in fact, as a teacher, kind of welcomed that kind of variety. I have to say, and you know, some of them are here, and maybe some of them will listen, it's been an exceptionally good group of students. They've really helped me think this through. This is the first time I've taught this body of literature in this configuration. And they've been very open to kind of looking at the literature itself, seeing what's there, and then beginning to link it with larger questions. We started the semester off by reading Elizabeth Kolbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, which has a lot of interesting information about our present environmental condition, is also a wonderful intellectual history of the 18th and 19th centuries, which is why I chose it. And toggling back and forth between Elizabeth Kolbert's unnatural history, The Sixth Extinction, and something like Gilbert White's natural history of Selborne, or moving between her discussions of ocean acidification and Robinson Crusoe, and then moving around campus and going and visiting the Natural History Museum, special collections at the library, and next week a field trip I'm particularly looking forward to, the power plant here at the university, to begin to understand the ways in which we ourselves are caught up in some of the very same systems. I imagine has been eye-opening for some of the students, but it sounds like a cliche, but they really are helping me learn about this material as much as I am helping them learn. It's part of kind of piecing this all together and trying to figure out what it all means. I always tell them that literature doesn't give us any answers, but it helps us formulate the right questions, and I think that's what we're kind of engaged with in this class.
And isn't there also a question about, you know, you mentioned Robinson Crusoe and the guy sort of taking hold of his environment and shaping his space and so on, this sort of individual aspiration and, you know, I can see how that's, you know, very appealing in that book and otherwise. Those of us who grow gardens in our backyards, you know, you're very proud of this little space you've transformed. But with the Anthropocene, we're actually thinking not so much about an individual, but about what we do as civilizations, as cultures, as...
Well, one of the fascinating things about Robinson Crusoe is that while the myth is the individual on the island, in fact, it's well aware, anyone who reads the novel closely, that he's benefiting from a global system of commerce and exchange. Not only a vast slave trade of which he's a participant, but enormous movement of commodities back and forth. In the last part of the novel, when he leaves the island, he turns it into a colony and begins to profit enormously on it. And so the rise of a kind of global capitalism, of which London is clearly an epicenter, is very much also part of what Robinson Crusoe is all about. And then the way in which the novel and the myth, as it were, of the individual autonomous person creating his or her own world out of his own environment becomes, in some sense, a kind of fuel justifying and rationalizing increasingly widespread and even planetary transformations.
Yeah. Wow. Are you going to teach this course again?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good. I think you've probably inspired a lot of interest here. This is really, really great. And you, Erica, how much longer do you have in your program now?
Forever. No, I think, let's say 2 years.
Yeah. Say that. That's great. Oh, well, thank you so much for explaining what you're doing, for sharing some of the work you're involved in, Eric. This has really been great. So Eric Gidal and Erica Damon have been our guests in this segment, and thank you all for being here for these 3 parts of this series on energy cultures in the age of the Anthropocene. We've been at Film Scene here in downtown Iowa City, a nonprofit cinema arts organization, and you can join us for these live broadcasts if you like, or catch them on UITV, on iTunes, on the International Program's website, and we invite you to our next program, which will be here in this space on April 28th at 5 o'clock. Very interesting topic, and I hope you can join us, the Arab Spring in a Global Context. So we will see you next time. Good night, and thanks for being with us.